Hi, I'm Maximus, and this is my formal Challenger disaster speech. And this is in real time, by the way. The Challenger shuttle disaster was a tragic yet preventable loss of life. The shuttle 51L was launched during a time when NASA was receiving less funding and they had to commission their parts from private companies. For the O-rings, a senator gave the contract to home-based Morton Thiokol in the face of bids from contractors with more suitable experience. This was not the main cause for the disaster. Using articles and reports, I've been able to identify three main management errors that led to this disaster. Them being NASA's pressure to launch, Thiokol engineers not taking the designated avenue in reporting, and the nature of normalization of deviance in NASA. The first point I will be going over is the pressure NASA was under to make this launch. The reason this point is important is because this pressure could bias the decision made by management for launching the shuttle. Before this launch, there were months of launch delays, which drove decision makers to focus on the scheduled launch window. 51L, the shuttle disaster launch, was originally scheduled for July 1985. This launch happened around 6 months after it was initially planned. Another component of the pressure was that this launch would have signified the first civilian in space. As this was during the time of NASA was receiving a lowered amount of funding, this would have acted as a huge publicity stunt, regaining the public's interest and encouraging people that space was truly the future, and it was almost here. The months of delay from July all the way to January, and the potential publicity boon from launching a civilian into space are both sources of pressure on NASA. The second main management error was that the contracted group Thiokol did not take the right avenue of reporting the O-ring issue. This point has a couple of implications, such that there were no avenues at the time Thiokol wanted to delay that would have accommodated such an emergency, and that Thiokol did not use the pre-existing avenues of reporting since they started to reporting too late into the launching process. To understand this point in its entirety, the organizational structure of NASA at the time is of vital importance. There are 4 different levels in this structure. Level 4 is the contracted companies, such as Thiokol. Level 3 is the project managers of these companies. These are a bunch of engineers. And level 2 and level 1 are the project leaders and highest levels of management. These guys are not huge on the engineer aspect, but it's NASA still. The standard pre-flight component check is focused upon the Level 1 Flight Readiness Review, held approximately 2 weeks before a launch. This utilizes all 4 levels of organization. This would have been the time for Thiokol to bring up any concerns about the temperature. Unfortunately, they did not communicate their concerns. Example, no mention of the O-ring problems appeared in the certification of flight readiness, no mention appeared in the certification endorsement, no mention appears in several inches of paper compromising the entire chain of readiness reviews for 51L. The time that the concerns were brought up were within 24 hours of the launch, and at this time, Level 1 and Level 2 personnel were the people who could stop the launch. It is still important for management to be aware of this and the hidden dangers of the O-rings failing, but after this time, there is not a clear window for Level 4 and Level 3 parties to interact and convince Level 2 and Level 1 management. In fact, there is one guy connecting them, Mr. Reinhardt, that could, and this is his testimony. Somebody asked him, Mr. Reinhardt, are you telling us that you, in fact, are the person who made the decision not to escalate this to a level 2 item? And Mr. Reinhardt replied with, that is correct, sir. The issue is partially him not escalating the O-ring issue, but also that there was only one avenue for this escalation at this late stage of launch planning. That's not the only aspect of this. The main reason Thiokol's concern should have been treated seriously is because the O-rings that failed were rated Criticality 1, a term denoting a failure point without backup that could cause a loss of life or vehicle if the component fails. Unfortunately, they weren't, and not because these concerns were unworthy of concern, but because the decision to launch the Challenger was flawed. Those who made the decision were unaware of the recent history of problems concerning the O-rings and the joint. Thiokol engineers did hold a meeting within 24 hours of the launch in an attempt to convince some members of management. There was a shift in the nature of these meetings due to how they normally are, because of how close they were to the launch. Instead of trying to convince the management that their parts would work, they had to prove that they wouldn't work. This showed some projected charts, but when asked if they could quantify their concerns, they said they couldn't. They couldn't quantify it. They had no data to quantify it. since the management didn't understand that the O-rings were criticality 1 items and the engineers had no actual data suggesting that the O-rings would fail completely, their concerns were ignored and not escalated to key level 1 and level 2 personnel. It has been theorized that if a proper regulatory branch existed, regulatory agents could intervene, possibly averting a technical system accident. The theoretical engineers were concerned about a criticality 1 component, and this would flag the regulatory branch to investigate and possibly postpone the launch. This brings us to the third management error that contributed to the Challenger shuttle disaster, NASA's normalization of deviance. This normalization of deviance in reference to NASA is one specific but repeated unanticipated problems continue to occur without significant issue. There was a couple of launches when the first O-ring didn't seal, so erosion started to occur on the second and final O-ring. This caused the launch constraint that needed to be waived for each flight, but neither the launch constraint, the reason for it, or the 6 consecutive waivers prior to 51L were known to Moore or Eldridge, the respective level 1 and level 2 management figures, at the time of the flight readiness review process for 51L. This lack of communication and the laxing of regulation both contribute to NASA's normalization of deviance and then to this disaster as a whole. The contribution that NASA's management made to the Challenger shuttle disaster was, firstly, the pressure from both the months of launch delays and the first time for a civilian in space. Secondly, the theoretical engineers had no adequate avenues to report this issue because of their tardiness and lack of communication between levels of management. Thirdly, NASA's normalization of deviance, which was caused by both a laxing of regulation and lack of communication. This could potentially be prevented by a regulatory branch that would flag theoretical's concerns to the level 1 and level 2 management because of the criticality 1 level of the O-rings. Another potential solution to this issue would be having theoretical and other contracted companies actively testing the limits of their components. This way they would know that the O-rings would fail at the temperature of this launch, which would prevent this tragedy. Thank you for your time.